What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. You might notice this is a longer video than usual. I've been thinking of interspersing some longer compilation videos throughout the week in addition to the weekend, but unlike the compilation on Sunday, these are stories that I've double-checked to make sure that I have never read before. So these are all new stories that you can enjoy just like my normal videos. Like compilations on Sunday though, all the ads will be at the very beginning after the first 2 or 3 stories. So after that, you won't have to worry about any more ads and you can just listen to this video in the background like a podcast or as background noise or however you'd like to. Let me know what you guys think, and without further ado, I will let you guys enjoy the stories in this video. Please enjoy and have a great day. I'm a biologist and frequently find myself in remote locations because of this. This occurred when I was 26 and somewhere between green and seasoned. I was surveying some wetlands in a remote area of the Appalachians. It was a part of the region that's particularly dominated by thick pine forests. I always got on the county assessor site and printed off a map with landowner information so I wouldn't get tagged for trespassing. That'll get you shot if you're not careful. This particular site, there was a driveway that ran through the U.S. Forest Service land, which is public. That allowed me to get into this area a little quicker. This driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass during this event. I pulled onto this road that was clearly created by the USFS and pulled off to the side about 30 yards from a private entry gate. My vehicle was a government vehicle. The forest is old-grown pine, but the outer edges of the forest is thick with undergrowth, forming a sort of wall before you even get underneath all the pine trees. I walked about 200 yards in when nature started to call. I made like a bear in the woods and did my business. I'm used to this sort of thing, so it was no big deal. Midway through though, I heard a yelling back at my truck. I thought, great, now what do I have to deal with? I was wrapping up my business and getting ready to walk back when I heard gunshots ring out. I stopped walking and thought, yeah, I'm not walking back in that direction. I was at a loss of what exactly I should do though. I stood there for about a minute, considering my options, when I heard whoever it was breaking through the undergrowth on the edge of the forest. Well shit, he's coming into the woods now. I thought again, this is public property. I was getting a really bad vibe creeping up my spine. This is absolutely the type of area where people just straight up disappear. It's very remote, and the communities are all very closed off. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of other counties, for very good reason. I take off in a crouching jog, using my sense of direction to make it out to the main road. I was about 600 yards away when I heard more gunshots ring out. These had a crack to them though. That meant they were coming in my direction. There was no way the guy could see me, but maybe he was hearing me and firing randomly above my head or something. Adrenaline started to kick in. I was now moving with a mix of terror and urgency to get back to the main road. I eventually made it and hid underneath a bridge. I called a colleague and gave him the details of where I was, so they could at least find my body or something. I then called 911. This was the first time in my life I ever had to call 911. The operator didn't believe me, but eventually I did get in touch with a deputy. Unfortunately, he didn't believe me either. He gave me some speech about how they were probably just shooting tin cans. Motherfucker, it's Sunday night at 7 p.m. He was too lazy to get off his ass. I moved further away into a public hunting area, and finally a game warden stopped by. At least he took me seriously. A few of the locals also came by as well, and commented that they knew that particular landowner. He's an asshole. He was from Louisiana, I guess, and not even a local. I got along well with most of the locals I had encountered, so this made a little bit more sense. After about an hour, the warden gave me a ride back to my state vehicle. That son of a bitch was parked on an ATV and had a rifle laid across his lap waiting for me in the dark. The warden and I got out of the car, and I just walked straight back to my truck and left. It was about 9 p.m. then, and I had a 4-hour drive to get home. Just enough time. I didn't want to talk to this guy. Now though, I kinda wish I knew what conversation the two had after I left. After this, I started carrying a firearm in the field with me at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling and insisted on an escort back to my truck. That was not an encounter or conversation I wanted to have with someone with an overactive trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information from the county assessor site. I thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property line begins and ends, but I just let it go in the end. Maybe he thought I was some type of creeper or something. Either way, the guy's a fuckhead. I have a story of the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me. When I was 7 years old, I lived with just my mom. After she left my dad, she started dating this very nice man. He lived on our street, and after I'd say about a month of him dating or so, he started to stay over at our house at night. He was a dentist and was really funny. He used to tell me a lot of jokes before I went to bed and say things like, "Did you make sure the monster under your bed isn't there tonight? If he is, just let me know and I'll beat him up real good for you." Being the young girl I was, I often would check under my bed just to make sure. One night he said what he normally said to me, but I responded, "There are no monsters. I've checked under my bed already." No monsters were ever there whenever I checked. Now, I told him monsters weren't real. He then looked at me and said they are real. He had seen them, and I needed to be careful. That night, I woke up to hear noises coming from underneath my bed. I was horrified, of course. I laid there just listening to these sounds. I was too afraid to check underneath. I told him I'd heard something underneath my bed that night, and he told me something along the lines of, "I told you so." That following night, I woke up to the same noises, but this time, I had the courage to look underneath. I stood up on my bed and jumped to my bedroom door, then turned on the light and kneeled down and looked underneath the bed. My mom's new boyfriend, the dentist, was laying underneath my bed smiling at me. He started to say something, but I ran to my mom's room and woke her up. Needless to say, she was very confused. After that night, I never saw that weirdo around again. I guess she dropped him like a hot rock or something. Hello everyone, I have a very creepy story to share with you all. It all happened in my own home about 3.5 years ago. I've been divorced for about 10 years now, and this happened one night when my kids were over at my house. I was asleep in bed when I began to hear a noise. It was a very startling noise, like cabinets being slammed in my kitchen repeatedly. I'll be honest, I was afraid to even go check what it was. I'd never heard something like this before in the middle of the night. My kids were home though, so I had to see what it was as fast as possible. When I went out to my kitchen, the noise had already stopped. The cabinet door to my pantry was open though, which it never was left open. I looked around my house and checked on my kids as well. They were both still in bed. My son was wide awake and had heard the noises too, but my daughter had apparently slept through it all. I didn't find anyone or any explanation for the noise. I returned to bed and stayed vigilant, but I didn't hear anything again that night. The very next night, though, I was awoken once again to the exact same noises. When I rushed to check, I came up with nothing. Once more, my son had heard it too, but my daughter was fast asleep when I checked on her. I went back to bed and laid there awake and confused for hours on end. I felt very nervous and scared about what that noise was. The next night, though, I would find out exactly what was causing it. I was dead asleep when suddenly, right next to my bed this time, my closet door began violently slamming repeatedly. I jerked awake and turned over to see my daughter standing at the closet slamming the door over and over. I was terrified as I saw she was just staring at me with this wide grin. I jumped out of bed and stopped the door from slamming. I looked down into her eyes and she looked like she was not there. Apparently she was sleepwalking. The next day she told me she had no idea anything had happened at all. What's really unusual about this is that it never happened again. As far as I know, she never had another instance of sleepwalking after this. One night, I had fallen asleep on the bed in my work clothes. It had been a very long day, so I was really tired. When I awoke, it was still dark. I was somewhat delirious. I sat up and kicked off my shoes from my feet, when just then, I heard the baby on the baby monitor. I picked up the monitor and heard my wife humming. I smiled as she whispered, "Go to sleep, go to sleep." My smile faded though, as I turned over and saw my wife was still asleep in our bed. I sprinted to the baby's room. She was crying, and the window was left wide open. The screen was laying outside on the grass, too. That was the most horrifying thing I could possibly imagine happening. Something very creepy happened to me on Christmas. I had celebrated the holiday that morning with my family and went to see my parents on Christmas night as well. I had to go into work though to finish up a proposal I was working on for a new potential client. I obviously didn't want to go, but it had to be finished nonetheless. I worked in a building downtown that was fairly close to a few nightclubs and bars. My office is on the 23rd floor, and in my position, I have an office, but most of the floor is filled with cubicles. My office is in the very far corner next to my boss's, so to get to that area, you have to walk by all the cubicles in the center. I didn't get there too late, probably around 8 or 9 or so, but there was nobody else there. This was my second time going it alone. It was pretty peaceful actually. If I let my imagination run wild, however, I would get spooked quite easily. As I walked the path next to the cubicles, I was reminded of what I was currently missing at home while looking at all the Christmas lights strung up, decorating people's workspaces. There were no actual lights on, but it was lit up well enough by all these Christmas lights that I could still see. I reached my office and unlocked it. I walked inside but didn't close the door. My computer and desk faced away from my door, so I couldn't see anyone that approached my door. On work days, I always found this very annoying, as I never knew who would be knocking until I got up and opened the door to check. I sat down and began working as quickly as possible. I wanted to get home as soon as I can. After a while, I'd say about an hour into it, I heard the main entrance door close. I'd never heard it open, but when it closed, it made a distinct noise that was unmistakable. I wasn't too spooked at this point, though. I was just curious as to who else was unlucky enough to have to come in and finish something with me. I got up from my desk and walked out onto the floor. I looked around, but I didn't see anybody there. I called out fairly loudly, "Hello?" Nobody responded at that moment, though. I started to get paranoid and freaked out, because I definitely just heard the entrance door close. Somebody was here. Either they'd left immediately or they were still in here with me hiding, not responding to what I was saying. I was just about to turn around and go back into the office and try to brush off what I heard when I saw a head stick up out of the cubicle on the opposite side of the floor. Whoever it was looking right at me. I could see it appeared to be a man, but I couldn't make out any details of his face. I thought it must be one of my coworkers messing with me, so I shouted over to him, "Hey, What a time to have to come in, huh? I hoped whoever it was would stand up and laugh with me, but they didn't. The man didn't move at all. This scared the crap out of me, so I tried to make conversation again. Hey, guy, you know I can see you, right? He didn't move at all. I wasn't sure what to do now. I was scared shitless, so I felt through my pocket for my keys. They were still there. I started walking down the path toward the entrance door, the whole time keeping a firm eye on this guy. As I was walking, I think he was watching me go. I looked over to the entrance door for just a second. One damn second. When I looked back, the man was already gone. After seeing this, I thought, oh my god, is he moving over toward me? I jogged the rest of the way to the door and rushed through it. I jogged over to the elevator too and slammed that button down hard. I turned around quickly as I heard the entrance door slam closed. It made that same distinct noise as before. The elevator door thankfully opened right away, and I went inside. I hit the first floor button, and the door closed quickly. I didn't see the guy following me. I drove home and told my wife what happened. I also had to call my boss and tell him the reason for not finishing my proposal that night. Thankfully, he was fairly understanding. I went back 2 days later with everyone else. I never found out who that guy was or what that was all about. Nothing was stolen or tampered with to my knowledge, so what could he have been there for that night? This encounter happened to a friend and coworker of mine about 15 years ago. We'll call this friend Jody, and she lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, with her parents and older brother. It was a pretty nice neighborhood, and they didn't really have to worry about crime or break-ins or anything like that. One night though, at about 2 a.m., Jody was woken up by a loud knocking at the front door. She jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway, where her parents and brother were also coming out of their rooms. The knocking had since turned into a furious pounding. "Stay here," said her father, as he made his way to the front door. All of a sudden, there was a muffled male voice shouting, "Help me! Help me!" Jody and her mom grabbed each other in fear. Her dad looked out the peephole, only to see there was nobody there. He then looked out the front window too, where he could see part of the front door and porch, but he still couldn't find anyone. He walked back towards his family when the knocking started up again, this time much more frantic. The voice called out once more, "Help me! Help me, please!" Jody's dad went to the phone and called 911. While he was talking with the operator, her brother had walked up to the front of the house. The pounding was still going, getting faster and faster, until it was a constant banging and pleas for help. At this point, Jody was in tears from fright. She looked over at her brother, who was standing in the family room now. It was located just to the left of the front door. His face was pale white, and he made a gesture for them to come join him. Jody, her mom, and her dad, who was now off the phone with the police, hurried into the family room, where they immediately realized why her brother's face had gone so pale. The pounding and shouting appeared to be coming from underneath their floor. The police arrived minutes later. It turned out that some guy in his 20s had gotten high out of his mind that night on crack and made his way into the crawl space underneath the house. They never did find out his intentions, but it was assumed he was trying to find his way inside, presumably to rob them. Then, though, he got disoriented because he was so high and freaked out, hence the pounding and shouting. This story still gives me goosebumps to this day. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the city of San Jose, California. Whenever my mother could afford it, she would take me to a theme park in the neighboring town of Sunnyvale called Great America. We went about once or twice a year. The rides were all really fun, and the food was great too. I wasn't paying, so I had a good time whenever we went. That is, except for one time when I was 7 years old. About an hour or two into our day there, I got that feeling. You know, the one when you get that sneaking suspicion that someone you can't quite see is watching your every move. I mentioned it to my mother, and she said I was just imagining things. We went on about our day, and it was very fun as usual, but I still couldn't shake that feeling all day. In fact, it steadily got worse and worse until I literally started begging my mom to take me home. Eventually, she obliged, but she couldn't figure out what had gotten into me. Now, a little backstory. My parents got divorced when I was only a baby. When I was about 11, they reconnected and decided to get back together. So we moved to a shitty little town up north called Eureka. My dad's dad, I refuse to refer to him as my grandfather, lived in that same town. He never talked to anyone, not even his own son. He was in every sense of the word a recluse. He passed away not long after we moved there, and my dad, being his next of kin, was tasked with going through his things. The first word that came to mind when we entered the house was paranoid. There was at least one rifle in every single room, sometimes 2 or 3. There was a Colt 45 under his pillow, and another under the driver's seat of his car. There was a snub-nosed 38 in a Ziploc bag in back of the toilet. There were cameras mounted on every exterior wall, and there were boxes upon boxes of VHS tapes with the collected recordings from these cameras, some of which were nearly worn out from repeated viewing. Suddenly, from the master bedroom, I heard my mom yell out, "What the fuck?" My mom very rarely swore in front of me, so I knew it had to be something fairly serious. I ran into the bedroom, and what I saw in my mom's hand shocked me to my core. It was photos of me and my mother at the theme park that day. I was about 7 in those photos, walking along with a corn dog in one hand and a drink in the other. I had a suspicious look on my face, and I instantly remembered that day. My mother said that she felt faint and left the room. As it turned out, there were hundreds of pictures of us from that day, as well as from other times and places too. Some of them even appeared to have been taken from within arm's reach. I never felt so creeped out in my life. I don't know why he was spying on us, and I'm not sure I want to know. This incident happened about 7 or 8 months ago. I was the night shift desk clerk at a hotel, and let's just say there are a steady stream of creepers that pass through the lobby. I've had a ton of uncomfortable situations throughout my 3 years of employment there, but there was one particular guy that terrified me. It was around 2 a.m. or so when the guy walked into the lobby. The first thing I noticed was that he smelled god-awful, like burning plastic or something. I shrugged it off though, because at the time there were a lot of contractors that were in the area working at a chemical plant nearby. I just assumed he was one of those workers looking for a quick nap or a hot breakfast. The morning came by and my shift ended. Fast forward to my next shift the following night. The smelly man from the night before had left all of his belongings in his room and was now nowhere to be found. He'd only paid for a single night, so the housekeepers had to move all his things to the storage room so they could prepare the room for the next guest. Around 8:30 p.m. or so, I get a call from a police officer. Apparently, this guy was a wanted fugitive because he'd nearly beat his wife to death just 2 hours before he checked in. I informed them of the items he'd left in the hotel room. I get the whole "do not engage, he's a dangerous and violent offender" speech, and now I was really scared. They said it was highly unlikely he would come back, but to excuse myself politely and call them if he did show up. Well, needless to say, he ended up back in the lobby not even 20 minutes later. He demanded the luggage he'd left behind. At this point, I'm doing whatever it takes not to show fear, because now I'm fully aware of what this fucker is capable of doing. I tried to play it off like I didn't know where his things were, so I could make an excuse to go upstairs and call the police. I'm not too sure where they are. Let me go take a peek in a few of the storage units upstairs. If you could just wait here in the lobby, I'll be just a moment. He didn't say a word, so I assumed he was fine with that. As I started walking up the stairs though, about halfway up I realized he was following behind me. It was at this moment I started to flip out internally. I had no idea what to do. I began to fake search through a few different closets. After about 10 minutes of this, he started to get very hostile. Where is my shit? I need my things right now! He slammed his fist through a wall to make his point. There was now enough distance between us, though, that I felt comfortable making a run for it. I fumbled with my master card and managed to lock myself in the closest vacant room. He banged on the door for a while, but left a short time later. The cops came about 20 minutes after this, but he was already long gone. Of course, they searched through his bags, only to find a stash of meth and drug paraphernalia. That explains the awful scent and his determination to follow my every step. I quit shortly after, and I'm still unsure if they ever actually found him. When I was a kid, I met a psychopath. Not an adult psycho, a kid the same age as me. He lived right next to me, and we lived out in the country. I still do now, actually. I've always loved living out here. So much freedom and peace and quiet. When I was a kid, exploring the farms nearby and down the old roads was the hip thing to do. When I first met this crazy little boy, I was around 10 years old. You could tell right away that he wasn't really all there. There was something wrong with him. You know, just when you were talking to him, you could tell there was something not quite right. I quickly learned how he really was when we went off to play one time. He would insist upon chasing chickens around, which was fine, I guess, but not really my idea of fun. I'd much rather build a treehouse or go exploring. Like I said though, I chased those chickens with this kid. But one time, when he actually caught the chicken, is when I realized I wanted nothing further to do with him. He just butchered it right in front of me. I was so shocked. He just grabbed a small hatchet and started hacking away at it. I acted like I was fine, but when I got home, I told my mom and dad what he did. They just told me to stay away from him from then on, and they would try to speak with his parents. From what I saw at the time, he had an alcoholic mother that paid very little attention to him. And his father, I had no idea. I wish I could say the story ends there, but yeah, it didn't. Unfortunately, I wound up hanging out with this kid quite a few more times. One of those times, my cousin had come over to spend the night. The next day, we were running and playing around when I think we found some rope in a barn. The old rope was about 5 feet long. We thought it would be fun to tie each other up in the barn. The kid that was tied up would try to escape from the binds, then commence with finding the other kids. A different version of hide-and-go-seek, if you will. I was tied up first. My cousin disappeared to hide, and very shortly after, the weird demented kid appeared in front of me. Thinking back on it now, I'm pretty sure he was spying on us and saw that I was alone and tied up. He came up to me with a very sinister smile on his face, like he knew he could do anything he wanted, and I was helpless. He walked up to me and knelt down to my face and whispered into my ear, "I'm gonna send you down to the fucking hellhole." I didn't say anything back to that because of how scared I was. He grabbed my face with both his hands and threw my head to the ground hard. It's silly, but I really felt like this kid was going to kill me. I told him that really hurt and to stop doing this. My cousin ran back in because of all the commotion, and that kid just acted like we were best of friends. He even asked if he could play with us. I told him no and to leave us alone. My cousin was very confused, but I told him later about what the kid had done. The last time I came into contact with him was weeks later. It was at the same barn. I was alone, just walking around exploring. I walked to the back of the barn, where there were very old metal bars laying around everywhere, as well as some old farming equipment. I saw some bright blue sneakers sticking out from behind an old tractor, and my curiosity led me to see what was happening behind it. When I got to the back, I was extremely startled to see the kid sitting on the ground surrounded by dead chickens next to him, smearing their blood all over his face like war paint. I said nothing and left in an instant. I really didn't have the desire to explore around my house anymore after. Thank God my mom and dad bought a new house far away from there, only months later. I have no idea what became of that kid in the end, but I'm sure he's locked away in a padded room somewhere. Every August, the county I lived in would throw a huge fair. There were games, rides, shows, and food, all that good stuff. They'd come around for about 2 weeks. Then they would take it all down, and I'd have to wait an entire year for them to come around again. I want to say this happened in 2008 or so. I know I was around 7 at the time, just tall enough to ride something I had wanted to go on for a long time. I convinced my mom to let my cousin Jared and I ride it. Jared was about 2 years older than I was. My mom trusted us to be safe, so we ran off to ride the ride. After we did so, Jared had to use the bathroom real bad. The fair only had porta potties though, so I had to just wait outside for him to finish. And that's when this random man just walked right up to me. He told me that I had to go with him right now. When I asked him why, he said my parents had called on him to come collect me. I know I should have run away or called out to Jared or something, but this guy said he knew my parents. It's an obvious lie looking back. He didn't even mention their names, but I thought surely if he knew my parents, then he wasn't a stranger. This guy grabbed my hand and started to take me out to his car. Now, to get to the parking lot of this fair, you had to walk a fairly long time, probably about 10 minutes. It's a huge field where they have the fair set up. I asked him where we were going. He told me they said they were going to McDonald's to get some food. The closest McDonald's was about an hour away, and I had just eaten not long before. I said I wasn't hungry, and I wanted to go see my mom instead. I started to try and walk away, but he grabbed my arm and started dragging me towards his truck. I froze. I knew this was a bad guy now, but I was in some sort of state of shock. I can't even remember if I tried to move or scream. All that really came out though was a strangled whisper. I remember crying without making a sound. We were right next to his truck now, and he was trying to force me into the back seat. That's when this young couple happened to see him. They must have seen me panicking and crying because the girl ran right up to me and grabbed me. She started screaming. The guy came over too. The bad man was already in his truck though. He ran over the other guy's foot as he sped away. That young couple saved my life that day. I have no idea what that guy would have done to me if he got me to go to where he was actually heading. I know for sure it wasn't McDonald's though. The couple walked me to the entrance as an announcement was made saying there was a missing child. My mom and Jared arrived shortly after. They were both crying. I remember running up to her bursting into tears before whispering why she'd asked that man to take me. She said she didn't know who tried to take me. We hugged and left after. We didn't go back to the fair again that year, or at all the next year either. My mom was paranoid the guy would still be there looking for children. I got over this fairly quickly though, and went on with my life. I only really remembered this because my girlfriend wanted to go on that same ride last year. Back in the summer of 2012 when I was 11 years old, I spent the night at my best friend Anna's house pretty frequently. She lived in a very wooded area, so her entire backyard could be considered a forest, and we very much loved playing in it. I practically never went inside when I was at her house because her entire backyard consisted of trees. There weren't many places to put things like a trampoline, for instance, back there, so they had to place it pretty far back in a small clearing. We were very naive kids and honestly believed nothing could happen to us in the woods. We were so sure of it that we played around in them at night as well. One particular night, we decided we would go play on her trampoline in the clearing. The trampoline itself was very old. Honestly, I was surprised it could still even hold people. It didn't have a net either. I hated that because I always feared I would go flying off one day and nothing would be there to catch me. All the same, we took off our shoes and climbed onto the trampoline. Something about jumping around in the dark was so exhilarating. I was having a blast, but as we continued to jump away, the atmosphere suddenly changed. I couldn't exactly tell what it was, but something about the woods seemed darker and more intimidating than before. My friend stopped jumping for a moment and completely froze, now staring off into a specific spot in the woods. I stopped looking too and followed her eyes to where she was looking. "There's a person," she whispered, pointing in that direction. My eyes widened and I tried to focus to get a better look for myself. Sure enough, I could just about make out a tall, shadowy figure of a man. It seems he'd noticed us observing him because he tried to hide himself behind one of the thick trees. He was still visible though, and it was absolutely terrifying. We stood there frozen, unable to yell or run. We just stared at him. He was a bit further back, but we could still see his movements. He slowly moved out from behind the tree. My eyes moved to his hand, and I could tell he was holding something. I had no idea what it was, but it made the entire situation even scarier. Our senses finally kicked in though. My friend pushed me to move, screaming for her mom. I flew off the trampoline, making one big leap before landing hard on the ground. For once, I was thankful there was not a net on there. I began to run, but looked back first. The man had begun to chase after us as well, and he was very fast. I screamed like I had never screamed before. We took off for her house. It felt like hours passed by before we reached her back porch. We threw ourselves into the living room. Actually, we were both laughing from hysteria, fear, and adrenaline. The feeling in my stomach was sickening. Her mother, after hearing what just happened, stomped onto the back porch and looked around the backyard. She couldn't see anything, but she yelled at them to get away while they still could. I'm happy to say we never saw that guy again. Of course, going around in the woods at night was never going to happen again either. I hope I'll never have another experience or encounter like that for as long as I live. Halloween 2015. That Halloween night started with myself and my buddy getting ready and putting on our costumes at my buddy's house. For the sake of privacy, I'll refer to him as Brad. Brad and I had been invited to a party by the girl he was dating. I was going dressed as a dead construction worker, while Brad was dressed up in his Maverick from Top Gun costume. We both looked pretty dumb, as we hadn't put very much effort into our costumes. He was just excited about seeing the girl he had just started dating, and I was equally excited to meet and flirt with some new girls that night. Once we were both ready to go, we headed out. Brad's new girl had sent us a text with the address attached. We GPS'd it, and Brad drove us both to the party. It was about 30 miles away, on the outskirts of our city out in the country. We drove down a very long, dark street with no street lamps, and eventually made it to the house. The house was at the end of a long driveway. When we pulled up, we saw a good number of cars and trucks parked out front. I'd say there were about 20 or so. We were both pretty psyched, as this party looked to be quite awesome. Music was blaring from inside the house. The outside was lit up with black lights and decorated with all sorts of Halloween stuff. Red light was pouring out of the windows from inside. This place was a 2-story too, so it was very nice. It was surrounded by acres of farmland, and there was not another house in sight. When we went inside, we found Brad's girl sitting on a couch in the living room, talking to 2 of her friends. We sat down and Brad's girl said hello. She came over to us, sitting next to Brad. She was dressed up as a vampire. The 2 people she had been talking to were wearing masks. One of them was a guy, and the other was clearly a girl. The girl was wearing a ghost face mask, and the guy was wearing just a mask with normal clothes on. His mask was one of those black blank face masks. We all talked for a while, with people rushing around us, dancing and getting hammered. The guy was really quiet though. He only spoke whenever somebody else spoke to him. I honestly thought he was a little bit weird and creepy. It didn't seem like he was having a good time either. We assumed that the 2 of them had come together, but we found out that the ghost face girl had come with 2 other girls. The guy said he had come with one of his friends, but apparently he couldn't find him now. After a couple hours of talking, laughing, and drinking, my vision was starting to get blurry. I was getting pretty damn drunk. Brad and his girl had long since gotten off the couch and walked off somewhere. The other 2 were still talking to each other on the couch right next to me. They seemed to be flirting and having a lot of fun at this point. I was just kind of people watching, sipping on my 5th mixed drink of Jack and Coke. That was when I noticed the blank-faced guy kept leaning his head back. I'm pretty sure he was looking upstairs at the bedroom doors. I couldn't tell because with his mask I couldn't quite see his eyes. The ghost-faced girl didn't seem to notice this though. She was all over him, talking his ear off. At some point, I positioned one of the couch pillows behind my head and started to drift off to sleep. Going in and out of consciousness, I woke up for a moment completely and looked around the room. My head was spinning at this point. There were way less people walking around. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 3:45 a.m. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and leaned my head back on the pillow. I was going to get some sleep again. I started to close my eyes, but right before I did so, I noticed that blank face guy leading the ghost face girl up the stairs. Her head was down. She looked like she was barely awake. He was helping her walk up the steps and they disappeared into the bedroom. Next thing I knew, Brad was shaking me and telling me he wanted to leave. I asked if he was cool to drive, and he assured me he was. I got to my feet. The room was spinning. It felt like I was going to puke right there. I managed to make it outside though. The sun had just gone up when we made it back to Brad's house. We both collapsed on his couches and passed out. Hours later, I awoke to Brad's sister, waking him up and questioning him. She asked if we had gone to that party out in the country. When we said yes, she was completely frantic. She told us somebody had been killed there last night. I became completely awake upon hearing this, and so did Brad. I sat there silent. Brad was asking who it was and what had happened to them. His sister said she didn't know the girl's name yet, but she had been found murdered in an upstairs bedroom. She had been stabbed to death. I thought to myself, there's no way. Sure enough, to my disbelief, later on that day, they showed us the girl that was killed. It was that very same ghost-faced girl from that night. She had been stabbed 36 times. The police questioned everybody who was at the party on Halloween, including Brad and I. Of course, I told them immediately about that suspicious guy who had brought her upstairs. That he was wearing blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and a black blank face mask. To my knowledge, though, they never found that guy. The person who hosted the party said she'd never invited that guy, nor did she see him there. So this happened to my family in early 2002, when my daughter was a baby. My wife and I moved into a new house right after our daughter was born. It was a nice place in the suburbs. I would rather not mention what city the house was in, though. The house was relatively new and surrounded by other houses with the exact same design and layout. We were still getting used to our new life there when one night we heard the baby crying on the baby monitor. We were watching a movie in the living room and paused it and went to the baby's room. The baby wanted her bottle. I stood in the doorway of the room while my wife tended to our newborn. I was smiling at the sight of this when suddenly my wife made a small sound of fear and surprise. She was looking out the window directly beside the crib. I walked over to her, but she didn't say anything. I looked outside in the direction she was looking and saw a woman that looked to be our age standing in the middle of our lawn and looking up into the bedroom window. I went into protective mode and immediately walked out of the room towards the front door with the intention of confronting this woman. My wife shouted before I could even open the door, though. "Oh my God, she ran away!" I ripped the door open and walked outside. I looked around the front of our house and walked a bit further into the street as well, looking in both directions. There was no sign of the woman at all. I decided to check the entire house to make sure this creepy lady truly had left. I walked the perimeter of our house and didn't find any trace of her. I came back inside to find my wife still holding the baby in our master bedroom. I told her I hadn't seen her. After a while of being creeped out and looking out all the windows to make sure she wasn't lingering around, we decided she was gone for good. We went to sleep. The next night, though, we saw the woman again. This time, my wife was in the shower, and I was holding our baby in her bedroom. That was when I looked out the window and saw the woman standing in the same spot on our lawn, peering into the bedroom window at me holding the baby. I looked at her for the longest time and didn't move. She didn't move either. My wife eventually walked into the room with a towel in her hair and approached me from behind, giving me a hug. I whispered to her, "She's back. Look at that crazy bitch, just standing there looking at me." My wife got incredibly creeped out at this point and insisted we call the police. I was going to, but I felt I wanted to confront her again, so I walked out the room and opened up the front door. It was only about 10 feet away from the baby's room. I walked outside. This time, though, the woman was still there. She turned to look at me. I walked out onto our front lawn, about 20 feet away from her. "What the fuck are you doing here? If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the cops, and if I ever see you around here again, I'll call them immediately." The woman just smiled at me, then opened her mouth wide and let out a nightmare-inducing scream, as if she was in horrendous pain. I knew right away there was something wrong with this woman, wrong in her head. She turned around and ran away. This was terrifying. I realized she was barefoot. She ran away like a little kid would, arms flailing about in the air. I went inside to see my wife was already holding the phone. I agreed with her that we should call anyways. We did so, and a couple of police officers came by the house a short while later. They said there was nothing they could really do except drive around the neighborhood a few times and keep an eye out for her. They said they would call us if they saw her. About 20 minutes after they'd left, they called and said they hadn't seen anyone fitting her description. We were disappointed, but eventually we went to sleep after taking turns looking out the windows for hours. I had assumed the woman had taken the hint. A month had passed by with no sign of her. Then one night, though, when my wife and I were in bed, I heard a noise and woke up. I glanced over at the alarm clock, only to see it was 3:48 a.m. I listened for the noise to continue and heard giggling coming from the baby monitor. I sat up in bed, my heart stopped, and I flew out of the room into my baby's room to see nothing but my baby sound asleep. My wife followed me in. I was very confused for a moment and thought I hadn't actually heard anything. Maybe it was just a nightmare. My wife asked me what was wrong, and I didn't respond for a few moments, then finally said, "Nothing. I thought I heard something." We both sighed and walked back to our room. My wife went into the room first, and upon entering screamed. then threw herself back toward me. I gasped and almost fell backwards onto the floor from the impact. My wife started repeating over and over, "Oh my God, oh my God." My heart was pounding as I asked her what was wrong. I forced my way past her and walked into my bedroom. The woman was sitting Indian style on our bed. I backed up out of the room and slammed the door. My wife ran and took our baby from her crib. The three of us went outside. As I was closing the front door, once we had walked out, I heard our master bedroom door open. Neither of us had our cell phones on us, so we ran to our neighbor's house and frantically started knocking on their front door. They answered very quickly and asked what was the matter. We explained what was happening, and they ushered us inside and called the police. The cops showed up minutes later. They went inside our home, and the woman was still there this time. They said they'd found her upstairs, sitting in the middle of the hallway in the dark. This happened at my house when I was about 11 years old. This one day, I believe I was playing video games when I heard a knock at the door. My parents were in their room chatting, so I ran to the door and looked out through the window next to it to see who was there. To my surprise, it was a police officer. I thought that was kind of cool, not realizing something could be wrong here. I opened the door. We had a metal screen that was locked in front of it though. The police officer knelt down to talk to me. "Hi there, are your parents home?" I told him yes, to which he responded, "Are you sure? There aren't any cars in the driveway or out front. Can you open the screen so I can talk to you?" I responded to him, "Oh, yeah, they're here. Their cars are just parked in the garage." I then yelled out to my dad. My dad asked what was wrong, and I walked over to their bedroom door. I told them a policeman was at the door. My dad looked concerned. He got up and walked over to the front door. The policeman was now gone though. My dad looked at me confused. I told him a cop really had been at the door though. He unlocked the metal screen and walked outside. I stayed in the house as my dad walked back in a few seconds later. "What did he say? Are you sure that guy was a cop?" I responded, "Yeah, he was wearing the outfit. He asked if you and Mom were here." My dad shrugged and said it was quite weird. He didn't say anything else. My mom asked if he said something was wrong. I shook my head no. I went to the couch and resumed my video game. A few days later though, another police officer came to our house. This time, my dad answered. Hello sir, sorry to bother you, but we had some calls from people on this street. They said a man came to their door dressed as an officer. Did he by any chance come to your house as well?" My dad told them what happened a few days previously. Then, the cops hit my dad with a bombshell. The man was not a cop at all, obviously. In fact, he was a man pretending to be one, trying to locate children who were home alone specifically. A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late at night, around 10 p.m. to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus through relatively busy streets to the main road in my area of the city, 109th Street in Edmonton. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter as it was in the middle of winter, snowing and a bit cold out. The buses ran by about every 15 minutes, so I wasn't too worried or nervous. I was just patiently waiting to get home. I was listening to some music on my headphones when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked at him briefly and did that little Canadian half smile of acknowledgement, then went back to listening to my music and browsing on Reddit. A few minutes passed by, and I could hear him saying something to me. Well, I assumed it was me, because there was no one else around. I looked up, only to find the man staring right at me and smiling a bit oddly. He was clearly speaking to me, even though I obviously couldn't hear him. I took out my headphones and said, "Excuse me?" He kept smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, what I like to do, etc. I don't know what it is about me, but I'm a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life seems to be to keep the peace, so I answered a few of his questions as politely and vaguely as I could. I had one earbud still in my ear. The man just kept blabbering on, and I just sort of nodded my head politely. He went on for about 10 minutes, and I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy. Something was off about him. It was enough to make me very nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling up now, which was a huge relief to me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop the entire time. I could see at least 10 to 15 people on the bus already, which was great news for me. I jumped on the bus and sat near the front. The guy sat right across from me, apparently so he could keep talking to me. I originally intended to head down to my house to the west of the street that I was on, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided to say screw it. I was going to my boyfriend's house instead now, directly to the east of the street I was on. I was getting a very uncomfortable feeling from this guy still, so I decided to push the stop button early to see what the guy would do. The bus came to a stop at my request, and the guy stood up immediately. I didn't move at all. "Isn't this your stop too?" he asked me. I said, "Whoops, I must have hit the wrong button." He looked at me and snarled for a second before saying, "Oh, that's funny. I got mixed up too. This isn't my stop either." He then sat back down at that point. I was pretty freaked out now. I hit the stop button for the next stop as well. Only this time, I'd texted my boyfriend to come out and meet me. I got up to leave the bus once it stopped, and the creepy dude followed close behind. I crossed the road. He was still trying to talk away at me and asking me a bunch of questions. Once I got to the other side, I told him I had to go and that my boyfriend was meeting up with me. He instantly got an angry look at the idea of a boyfriend and tried to follow me more. I stopped and told him I was going to be walking alone from here on out. He asked me if he could have my number. I panicked and froze for a moment. I decided to give him my number almost, except with the last 4 digits scrambled around. I read it off to him and said goodnight. I started moving quickly away. I'd only made it about 20 steps or so, though, before I could hear someone jogging after me. "Hey, I think there was a mix-up. I just tried calling that number and it wasn't you." He jogged up right next to me, giving me a sinister smile. "Oh, how weird," I said, grabbing my phone. I pretended to check it for a mixed call and quickly texted my boyfriend once again. I told him I was terrified and he needed to get here right now. "So, what's your real number?" the guy asked. I honestly don't know what I would have done if I had to be there any longer. I think I probably would have just given him my real number. I just had no idea what to do. It was cold, it was winter, and it was extremely dark in this little residential neighborhood I had entered. I knew there was no way I could outrun the guy. Luckily for me, though, that was when my boyfriend came running up to us. He's 6'3" and somewhat imposing. I turned to the guy and said to have a good night and jogged up to my boyfriend. I launched myself at him and didn't look back at the creepy dude at all. I did tell my boyfriend, though, to make sure all the doors were locked and the windows were closed before going to bed that night. I have a story I'd like to tell you all. This happened when I was 18, about 16 years ago. I was living with my parents in their nice house in Colorado. It was getting late one night, around 11:30 or so. I was on the phone with my girlfriend and had decided to go up to my room and switch phones, using the one that was in my room instead, so I wouldn't bother my parents too much. I assumed they were in bed now. Voices downstairs echoed upwards easily, and I had gotten in trouble for it a few times before. I told my girlfriend to hang on, and I was going to put the phone down for a minute while I went upstairs to turn on my phone. I set the phone down on the counter, right next to where it hangs up on the wall. I quickly ran upstairs and into my bedroom. My room was very cold, as I had left the window open. I slammed my window shut and picked up the phone next to my bed. "Alright babe, hold on one sec, I'm gonna go downstairs real fast and hang up the living room phone." I set the phone down on my bed and ran downstairs. I reached the last step, turned left and stopped. The phone was now hung up on the wall. I stood there for about 30 seconds, bewildered and a bit creeped out and confused. Maybe my parents had come down and hung it up for me. Except I didn't think that was possible. Surely I would have heard them, and I was only upstairs for about 30 seconds or so. I walked over to the phone, then turned around, looking around the living room and into the kitchen. There was no sign of anybody else though. Nobody else was in my house that night. I convinced myself I must have hung it up before I went upstairs. But then I thought about it a bit more. That wasn't possible. Then I would have hung up on my girlfriend as well. I walked into the dining room and nobody was there still. I walked back upstairs and over to my parents' door and pressed my ear against it. I could hear my dad snoring inside. Well, what the hell? I walked into my bedroom and almost had a heart attack when I saw my bedroom phone was now hung up as well. I turned around to the dark hallway. There was nobody there. I ran downstairs and to my horror, I saw the phone was gone altogether. I got goosebumps all over my body. My heart was now pounding out of my chest. I ran back upstairs and into my room. I ripped open my closet, but nobody was there. I walked over to my phone and picked it up. As soon as I did, I heard somebody on the other line. "I came in through your bedroom window, you know." I almost dropped the phone in fright. I thought, what the fuck? That's not possible. My bedroom is on the second story. I turned around again, expecting to see someone, but nobody was there. I opened my window and looked outside. I saw a large extension ladder there, leaning against my house just below the bottom of my window. I dropped the phone on the ground and ran to my parents' room. I slammed against their door with my fists and yelled for them to open the door. There was somebody in the house. My mom opened up with a confused and terrified look on her face. I went into their room, with my dad now sitting up in bed. I locked the bedroom door and repeated myself, "There's someone here and they have the phone. They just said something to me over the line." My mom ran to my dad's side of the bed and grabbed his work cell phone that was still in his jeans pocket. She called the police, and they were at our front door knocking about 15 minutes later. They searched the house and found no one. They did find the living room phone though. It was lying in the middle of the grass in our backyard. Call centers can be a weird place to work at. You talk to people from all over the country, and even sometimes all over the world. Most people are a little more, frustrating than anything. The same questions every single day will eventually drive you a little bit batty. I only wish those calls were the worst ones I've ever gotten though. I got the job as a customer service rep for a cable company just after I finished college. The hours really sucked too. 3 in the afternoon all the way until midnight. But the money was pretty good, and there were some medical benefits as well. It wasn't too great, but with loans to pay back, I took the first full-time job that came along. While some people need help with their cable after 10 p.m., there aren't that many of them, as you can imagine. 5 days a week, I was stuck at my desk taking calls from old men having trouble accessing skin flicks until midnight. Most of the night, though, was spent gossiping with another late-night employee. The calls never stopped for too long. It was the middle of spring when I got the first weird call. At first, this guy just sounded like your regular old confused customer, having trouble accessing some of the more mature channels. A little heavy breathing and a little stuttering, the usual. I was about to give him the usual spiel about turning off the parental locks when he cut me off. Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like? He muttered through these deep, excited breaths. Now that was far from the first prank I'd ever gotten. My immediate response was to hang up and mutter to my coworker about these annoying pricks on the other end. I shoved that memory of that call out of my head for a solid week or so. We got all manner of calls, so one stupid one wasn't enough to faze me. Late on a Friday night, though, just before midnight or so, a familiar breath entered my ears as I picked up the line. Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like? He asked. I do all the... I ended the call before he could finish what he was saying. Just my luck to get this creep calling in a second time. I asked my coworker if he'd ever gotten a call like that before, but he only shrugged and said it wasn't anything that was normal. I hoped that not engaging with this creep would be enough to get him to give up. 2 times wasn't much to be concerned with anyway. By the 3rd call, though, it was starting to get more personal. I hate how well I remember it. The weirdest thing about this 3rd call was how normal it started. It was a completely normal-sounding man on the other end, asking about our company and how long we'd been in business, what city the company was based out of, and the cost of our regular plans. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Then, though, he whispered into the phone line, I want to know what the flesh of a pretty young girl tastes like. My mind reeled as I ended the call as quickly as possible. For a prank caller, this guy was getting pretty tricky, and he was real dedicated too. I was almost starting to worry at that point, but then again, I didn't hear from him again for a while. I thought he must have given up the ghost or gotten bored or whatever. I didn't really care. I just wanted him to stop calling me. I wasn't going to be complaining when they did stop for an entire month. I was in the clear, and I even started to forget that strange caller and his creepy desires. I was over it, and had gone back to being generally annoyed by the other regular customers. I should have known better, though. A call came in one night, at nearly 1:45. It didn't even go to me, though. My coworker, the only other person working at the time, picked up the call. Hey, he called to me. This guy on the line's asking for you? I told him to pass the call over to me and I'd handle it. It wasn't the first time someone had dealt with me previously and wanted to continue with the same representative. I didn't really think anything of it. Hello, how can I help you this evening? I mindlessly asked into the phone. I want to know what your flesh tastes like. The familiar voice breathed in my ear. I want to savor it on my tongue. Leave me alone, I screamed into the phone. To my horror, the phantom voice laughed at my fury. He laughed and laughed until I ripped the headset off my head and stormed away from my miniature cubicle, tapping my finger hard against the end call button as I left. Maybe it was because he'd finally gotten a reaction out of me, or maybe because he was getting worse, but the calls ramped up to at least once a day now. I did everything I could to get him to leave me alone after that. I told my supervisors, I switched my shifts at the company. I even called the police. Somehow, they were unable to trace the call. At least they tried, though. The mystery caller kept calling 2, 3, sometimes even 4 times a day now. Each time telling me how much he desired to taste human flesh, often mentioning my flesh in particular. He mentioned other people he wanted to eat too, but it was always that he wanted to eat another human being. After a month of that, I quit. No 2 weeks notice, no offers to try and stick it out. I went to sit down at my desk one morning and realized I just couldn't bring myself to put my headset on. I couldn't handle this anymore. I got up and went to my boss and told him I was done. To my surprise, no one really judged me for it either. I probably stuck it out longer than they expected. I left with a glowing letter of recommendation. and mumbled words of apology that they couldn't do more for me. I spent a lot of time hiding out in my bedroom after I left the call center. After a couple of weeks without getting any weird phone calls or having to talk to anyone really, I started to go out again. Life started getting back to normal and I stopped thinking about that weird caller. While I hadn't forgotten about the terrible calls, I was able to push them out of my head for the most part. I even lined up a job interview that I was supposed to go to yesterday. The job was nothing special, but it was a huge step for me. I was all set to go for that interview. My suit was ironed, my hair was all styled. I felt better than I had in months. I even found myself smiling while I was waiting for the bus to come pick me up. That's when I heard it. Somebody leaned in and whispered in my ear as their breath washed over me. I know what the flesh tastes like now. I like it. I spun around hard as panic came over me, my eyes scanning the group of people moving toward the bus, but no one stood out from the crowd in particular. My mysterious caller had somehow found me in real life. Worse, it seemed he'd gone through with his sick, twisted fantasy. I didn't get on the bus. How could I? That guy was on there, and he knew who I was. But I didn't know him. I skipped my interview and went right back to my bedroom. At least it was safe in there. Now though, my cell phone always keeps ringing non-stop. I don't answer it if I don't know the number, no matter how long it rings for. It's just safer to let it ring away. I grew up in rural Michigan and rode the bus to school every morning. We lived in a house at the bottom of a hill on a country road. My bus stop, however, was at the very top of the hill after you passed by my house. The story I'm about to tell you happened when I was 7 or 8 years old. I woke up one morning and got ready for school like I usually did. My bus picked me up around 7 a.m., right when the sun was starting to come up. There were still spots of darkness deep in the woods though. I was the only kid who was picked up at my bus stop, so I would stand at the edge of the woods and wait till the bus came to get me. My mom or dad would have to drop me off about 5 minutes before the bus came and hightail it to work in order to make it there by 8 o'clock. It's not that they felt completely comfortable doing this, but they didn't have that many options at the time. We lived in a safe area anyway, or so we thought at least. The bus arrived on time 99% of the time, so they weren't too worried anything would happen to me in the 5 minutes I was left alone. So I'm standing there in the cold as usual, waiting for the bus to come along, watching the sun rise slowly in the sky. It was still a little dark out like I said before, and not yet bright enough for me to see what was going on in the woods around me. I saw the lights of the bus coming in the distance on time as usual. When it came to a stop right in front of me, my bus driver, Miss Teresa, opened the door and said good morning. She gestured for me to hop on. I walked to my seat, put my stuff down, and then I noticed that the bus was not moving yet. Miss Teresa still had the door ajar. She just sat there leaning slightly out of her seat, staring into the woods for a good minute or so before we were off on our way. We made our way to school after picking up a few more kids. After arriving there, Miss Teresa escorted us in, which is something she had never done before. I remember seeing her slip into the office as well and begin talking to one of the secretaries in a hushed tone. I went through my regular school day and was picked up by my dad afterwards. When he picked me up this time though, instead of being normal, he started asking me all kinds of questions. Did the bus pick you up okay this morning? Did any cars stop in front of you or blow their horn at you as you waited? Strange questions that he had never asked me before. The next morning, my parents didn't take me to the bus stop either. Instead, my mom dropped me off directly at school before going to work at a later time. This continued, with an alternating drop-off by either my mom or dad for the remainder of the school year. At the same time, I noticed they changed where my bus stop was as well. Years later, I found out why this had all happened. Miss Teresa had picked me up that morning, only to see a man standing in the woods right behind where I was. She alerted the school secretary, who alerted the transportation office for the school district. The police then investigated as well. They found some items wrapped up in a t-shirt back in the woods, a hunting knife, a rope, some rags or washcloth, and some tape as well. The police obviously never found out who that belonged to, but the bus driver, my parents, and the police felt certain that whoever it did belong to had the worst intentions for me in particular. I think about this often and wonder what would have happened to me had my bus driver been just a few minutes late, or had she not noticed the man standing in the woods after I boarded the bus. Because of that incident, the school district changed my bus stop to be located right in front of my house. That way I could just stay in my house until the bus pulled up. No more standing in front of the woods for me. I resumed riding the bus the next school year, and everything went perfectly fine after. Okay, so this happened to me about 7 years ago, when I first started high school. The school was about a 10-minute walk away from my little brother's school, so every day I would walk there to meet up with him. It's a pretty safe walk along the main road, with lots of light and cars as well. Usually there are not many people out and about though. Occasionally you'd find other school children or some joggers perhaps, some old people walking to their apartments or something, and of course people waiting at the bus stop. The bus stop was halfway between my school and my brother's. There were only ever about 2 people waiting there. One afternoon I was walking there to meet my brother. That day I'd left my headphones at home, so I couldn't listen to my music while walking, which is what I would normally do. That meant I was just walking and enjoying the sun shining down on me. When I reached the bus stop though, I noticed an old man sitting on the bench waiting for the bus. I passed him by and didn't think very much of him. He seemed to be completely harmless. I would say this guy had to be between 60 to 65 years old, pretty short and obviously not very fit either. As soon as I walked past him though, I heard him get up immediately. I didn't see the bus coming. Maybe he was getting up to check the timetable, but of course not. I turned my head to check, and the man was about 5 steps behind me, with his eyes glued onto my back. I started to speed walk, and I heard him speeding up too. I looked behind me, and sure enough, he was speed walking as well. I was scared that he wouldn't blink or take his eyes off me, and now, whenever I peeked back to look behind me, he was giving me this creepy, devilish grin. There was no one else around. I was about 200 meters away from my brother's school. I decided to book it and looked behind me once again. The old guy was now running after me. I couldn't believe it. He was way faster than I'd been expecting from his appearance. I looked back every time, only to see him staring and smiling. I was almost in tears. I was so scared that I wasn't going to make it. Now, I know what you might be thinking. A young teenage girl could easily outrun a man in his 60s. But with a heavy school bag and a tired knee from gymnastics, I was about as equipped to run as he was. By this point, I could see my brother's school coming up though, and some kids leaving as well. I was kind of relieved, and thought the man would ease up and notice other people were around. But no. What does this guy do? He starts yelling to people around that his granddaughter was running away from him and to grab her because she was in trouble, all the while giving me this evil grin. I kept running. I came upon the massive road. I didn't want to get hit by a car, so I moved out of the way slightly. This allowed the guy to get close enough to grab my bag. He told me to stop being such a little bitch and that he was going to win and take me away no matter what. I screamed and continued running for my life, not caring about the cars that might hit me. I slipped out of his grasp and got to my brother's school. I looked back to see the guy jogging towards me still. I ran into the main building and told the receptionist what was happening. She looked outside, where the man was waiting at the school gate, moving his head around as if he was trying to spot someone. I told her that was the man. She then told me to wait with her while she called police. The man walked away after about 10 minutes, but the police easily caught him. We found out he had been offering candy to kids from my brother's school and trying to get them to come home with him in the afternoons. After that, I walked on the other side of the road from then on, avoiding the bus stop altogether, and also avoiding anyone I would pass by. In the year 1972, my youngest sister and I were forced to move from our home in Norway to go live in the UK. My mother had just married an Englishman, you see, who had 4 children of his own. They were expecting another one as well. It was a miserable time for me because I was 6 years old. I'd not yet begun school in Norway, so consequently, I spoke no English at all. I had also been forced to leave behind my father and beloved grandparents. My own mother was more interested in her new husband than any of her children. My childhood was the unhappiest time of my life because of this, and this was only exasperated by the experiences in the manor house in which we moved to. The old manor house was situated in a seaside town. From the outside, it was the picture postcard of the British countryside. A large lawn surrounding the driveway, leading to a house, a glass greenhouse, stables around the back, and horses in the paddock as well. Behind this facade, though, we experienced such horrors that some I still struggle to talk about to this day. Us children all experienced paranormal activity, particularly at night, and it left us exhausted. Unfortunately, our parents were not particularly concerned with any of this, and often just shut us out. All we had were each other, and it was terrifying. You dreaded the sleep, and the activity that would come with it. I would sleep with my dog and cat on the bed, but even they could not bring me enough comfort. One night, when I was around 9 years old, I was awoken by my dog standing near the bedroom window, growling at the outside. My cat was standing with her back arched and fur standing on end. She was hissing loudly as well. All of a sudden, my dog whimpered, and then suddenly there was this dead silence. The room turned very cold, and it was almost like darkness seemed to engulf us. I got out of my bed shaking in fear and crept toward my bedroom window. My dog was now crouching and had pinned his head down to the floorboards. They creaked under my weight. As I reached the blackout curtains, I peeked out to see if there was an animal in the front yard or something. I didn't see anything out there though. I craned my neck and looked beyond the greenhouse as well. Again, there was nothing. I took a step back and went to draw the curtain, but then everything happened all at once. The dog started barking ferociously and frothing at the mouth. My bedroom door swung open and slammed hard against the wall. My posters blew off the walls. I turned back to the window and saw the face of a man smiling menacingly at me. Terrified, I spun around, expecting to see someone standing right behind me. When I did, though, there was no one there. I turned back to the window, and it was all gone. All that was left was a foggy imprint on the outside of the window, as if someone had just had their face pressed up against it, like they had been looking into my room. Only I was on the second floor. No one could have reached that far, at least not without a ladder. Since that day, I never forgot that face, but the activity continued further as well. I would wake up nearly every morning with my posters littered all over the floor and would spend the first part of my day pinning them back up. It was relentless. My parents never believed me though. After months of torment, I refused to leave my mother's bed at night. It was then when my stepfather was forced to sleep in my bedroom for a single night. Only after he experienced things for himself did he really believe me. When he woke up in the morning, all of my things were laying skewed on top of him. Despite all of this, there was one thing that did bring me comfort in my miserable childhood. I always missed my family in Norway dearly and cried myself to sleep most nights. One night, though, I felt a light touch brush beside my hair from my face. This simple, intimate action brought me so much comfort. I opened my eyes and saw an older woman sitting beside me. She had gray hair swept back into a tight bun. Reflecting on the clothes that she wore, I suspect she was once a maid or the head of the house or something. After all, this was a very old, large manor house. This person would visit me often and always brought this feeling of familiarity and comfort. Although I knew she wasn't alive like you or I did feel she kept me safe from that other ghost I saw in my window. I was not the only child in that house to have a paranormal experience either. My younger sister Ella shared a room with our stepsister Mary, and she would awaken nightly with fits of terror and sweat. She would often come into my room and curl up in my bed, frightened beside me. I only had a small single bed though, and it became too much to have her in my bed with me with all the pets. One night, when the usual routine of night terrors and her crawling into my bed had occurred, I told her to go to our mother's bed instead, insisting I would take her there. I held her hand and we left my room. We went to the landing my mother and stepfather's room was at the very end of. Right next to it, there was a very large Victorian mirror. We could see our reflections as we crept along the corridor and were careful not to wake up our sleeping siblings. Suddenly, we stopped frozen. I looked down at my sister and tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. She stared ahead at the mirror. My heart sank and I became overwhelmed with a feeling of dread. I slowly looked up in the mirror, only to see a figure coming towards us. We bolted back to my room and hid under the blankets. We heard the squeak of something passing us by. We didn't stop hiding or dare to look out. We stayed there until morning. I will never forget these events that happened to us. This happened when I was about 12 years old in Kansas. I was sitting in my bedroom playing some Halo. My parents were both out running errands, and my sister was at work. This meant I was home alone with my two dogs, a little terrier and a bison frise. Not exactly attack dog breeds, more like early warning systems at best. I had been home alone before and it wasn't really a big deal. We lived in a pretty safe part of town that never had any problems, other than one time where people sprayed some graffiti on some public park equipment. Anyway, I was kicking back in my chair, Doritos in one hand, controller in the other, really embracing that full gamer mode, when I heard the very distinct sound of a door opening and closing, like someone had just come in. The room I was in faced in such a way where I could not see the door from where I was. My dogs got up and ran into the living room, so I just assumed my parents must have come home. I shouted to my mom to confirm this, only to hear no response. The dogs also were not barking like they normally did when someone got home. I thought that was kind of weird, so I paused my game and walked out into the living room. Nothing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had just heard someone come inside clear as day. I was not wearing headphones and I had the TV turned down too, so I knew it hadn't been in the game. I immediately went to my parents' closet and grabbed our shotgun, like a good Midwestern boy tends to do. The only problem was that I didn't know where my dad kept the shells. My plan was to fake it and hope they didn't have a gun of their own. Yeah, it's a pretty stupid plan, but I wasn't exactly the brightest kid back then. At this point, doubt started to kick in. Had I actually heard the door? Maybe it was really in the game after all. Why would the dogs jump up like that though if it was? I walked back into the living room, unloaded shotgun pointing right in front of me. I tried to call my dad. He didn't pick up. I tried to call my mom and she didn't either. I tried to call 2 of my best friends only to have no response. My little boy mind immediately jumped to, holy fuck, they're all dead, for some reason. For the first time in my life, I dialed 911. The operator picked up, and I explained the situation with tears in my eyes from the fear. She told me to stay calm, and that the police were on their way. The difficult part of staying calm, though, was that there was a hallway right by my front door. I knew in my heart of hearts there must be someone hiding in that hallway about to jump out and really fuck me up. My 2 dogs were right beside me, also staring towards that hallway. I stood there rooted on the spot for what felt like hours. It was actually only a few minutes though. Thankfully, my parents then opened the door. "What are you doing?" I explained to my father the situation we were currently in, and he grabbed his pistol from the front room. Honestly, I hadn't even known that was there. We went hunting with our guns. I always thought it would be cool to go around clearing rooms like a SWAT team, but I was about to shit myself every time we opened a door. We didn't find anything in the end. The police arrived shortly after and told us this had been happening over the past few weeks. People wait until the homeowners leave, check the door, and if it's unlocked, they go in and take some valuables. They said whoever it was probably left when they heard that someone was home. That never quite sat right with me though, because I only ever heard the door open and close a single time. Ever since this happened, I triple check every door and window lock whenever I'm home alone.